and welcome back to the Legal Weekly Wine, where we discuss the week's hottest legal topics. We've got a little bit of a spattering this week. Nothing that's the biggest topic, but a lot of really interesting ones. So in this week's episode, we're going to be a little bit different than normal, where we're going to hit quite a few little topics rather than one or two really big topics. So what we have going on this week is we had oral arguments recently regarding the New York versus Donald Trump case that was heard earlier this year, back in February, with Letitia James, who was the attorney with the Attorney General's office. This is the one where we were talking about inflation of even apartment sizes, of net wealth, etc. And Trump's claim that what does it matter? There was no real victim. So we've got that hearing going on recently. It is pending. We don't have a final decision. We also have Jack Smith. So another Trump case. We've got this one is the DC case, election interference case, where we now have a motion from Jack Smith saying, all right, based on the Supreme Court's prior decision from the summer about presidential immunity, I'm now asking that we proceed forward, that he's not immune for these particular acts. So we're going to break that down a little bit. We've also got the execution issues. Last week, we talked about the Missouri execution, the one that went forward. And we're going to drop that down in the description so that you can catch that one from last week and catch up with us. This week, we've got another case that's now being heard. And this one hasn't had the actual execution. There's hearings and appeals on it. This is one in Oklahoma. So we're going to say, what's the difference? What's the same? Why would they be different? And would it have any different result? Ultimately, we're going to throw in words like federalism. So stay tuned with us today. I'm Virginia Tehrani. I'm the CEO of the Law Unscripted, which is the company that hosts the Law Unscripted podcast and the Weekly Wine podcast. We also offer supplemental bar review courses for law students, as well as some really fun merch. Chelsey, I believe you're wearing one of the pieces of merch that we have. Is that right?
I am. I told y'all this is my favorite shirt. I wear it all the time. So I'll show you guys again. It says in my lawyer era. I'm absolutely obsessed. It's one of my favorites.
Which you are. You are in your lawyer era. So we have some fun legal sayings. Check out our merch. Check out our products. Certainly law school exams aren't quite upon us yet, but as the semester goes through, I know a lot of law students start to panic with their final reviews. So we've got everything from outlines to actual lectures for you to choose from. I am joined by my colleague, Chelsey Rogers, who is just showing off our shirt. She is also with the Law Unscripted as well as Tehrani Law, LLC. Welcome, Chelsey.
Glad to be here. We have some fun, tiny little issues today that I think will lead to some interesting discussions.
Absolutely. And our third co-host today, as always, is Dr. John Vial. He is the Dean of the Honors College at Middle Tennessee State University. He is our expert on the Constitution, the amending process, constitutional law, and political science. Welcome back.
Good to be here. And by the way,
yes,
you never need an attorney.
Tell you do. Exactly. Thank you. Thanks for throwing our tagline in for our office. It's fun. Almost anywhere we go up in this area, our office is based in Maryland, and we practice in Maryland, DC, and Virginia. And we have the purple color that matches the Law Unscripted color. Our logos are very similar. And then our tagline, many people call and they say, so I'm looking for Virginia Tehrani or Chelsey Rogers, because you never need a lawyer until you do. And it's a lot of fun to actually be getting into the public and getting that brand out there. So thank you. Thanks for sharing our motto and our tagline. All right, Dr. Vial, let's start with you. I'm going to have...
Hey, Virginia, what are you drinking today?
Oh, my gosh. Yes. You know, it's probably because of what I'm drinking that I'm getting ahead of myself. I actually have caffeine today. So normally I drink wine. I have several in my pantry, or wine. I don't have a wine cellar. So do you call it the pantry? The wine,
I think you could call it whatever it identifies as, whatever you want to call it.
Well, in the fridge and in the pantry, wherever I store them, I do have quite a few lined up, including one from Luray, Virginia, where we went this past weekend. Check out our social media. Dr. Vial and I went home. Dr. Vial's my dad, and he grew up in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. And he went back to one of his reunions. I'm not going to say the year number of the reunion. And I was able to join him there. So we have a couple of pictures and fun times from this weekend in Luray. He attended the reunion while I took my family through the caverns and other sites. They have museums, an old car museum. They have a Shenandoah Village recreation. It's a really unique area. Absolutely beautiful.
Course.
A ropes course, yes. One of our family members, one of my uncles, one of Dr. Vile's brothers, actually owns and operates the ropes course that's affiliated with the caverns and is right outside. So that's a lot of fun. One of our other uncles operates a lot of the different campgrounds and some Airbnbs. Two uncles do some Airbnbs. So they're really entrenched in the valley. And it was great to see you in person, get a couple pictures in person for the Law Unscripted and the Weekly Wine. So good to see you, Dad.
Good to be here.
And as a fun little piece of information, fact for the day, Dr. Vile actually guided at the Luray Caverns.
And what we thought was James Monroe's house outside of Charlottesville.
Oh,
no. We've since learned that the original house burned down, and part of the house, I think, that was part of the original. But anyway, it is the same site, and a lot of good information if you ever go to the Highlands or Ashlawn outside Charlottesville.
Yeah, so he actually guided in the caverns, and this was when you actually were able to walk down the stairs into it.
Yes.
They have become quite treacherous lately, and we went in this time where they've got a walking entrance where they've drilled out and have that entrance, and they're able to say, now that's where you used to come in, and my husband was hilarious. He said, well, that looks really dangerous. And I said, and hence why that's no longer the entrance to the caverns. But Dr.
Speaking of which,
yes.
Did you see the disaster this week in Colorado?
In Colorado, no. I've been fairly focused on the storm.
I believe so. They have a tour of an old mine.
Oh, no.
And if I recall correctly, one person was there's a mine, and then they have an elevator, and then they go from the elevator by a little trolley or something into another part. And they haven't said exactly but there was some kind of malfunction. One person was killed, and approximately a dozen others, if I recall, were down in the mine for 5 or 6 hours until they could, adjust what was wrong in order to get them back up. Oh. And I suspect that would be fairly, there are no bathroom facilities there, but just also how terrifying it would be to be 1,000 feet or however many feet under the earth. This mine has been going, been having these tours, I think, for 30, 40 years. So
a horror movie, like that is
a horror movie for everyone except for attorneys, right?
Well, yeah.
When they get up and they're met by 100 different
here's
attorneys.
My card.
Yeah. You may be entitled to compensation.
But here's my card. Yeah.
Yes. Well, it was really peculiar. I was reading an article on it, and so when they got to the top, they fed them all pizzas, as though this would somehow compensate for the fact that you've been under the ground for 6 hours.
Oh, goodness.
Anyway.
Well, thankfully in the Luray Caverns, we didn't meet any of that.
No, and and a whole summer or two of guiding there, I don't ever remember having such a disaster.
Yeah, and I think you're the first of 3 generations we've had in the family guiding at the caverns now.
My Uncle Don guided there.
The second of 3. That's what it is.
Yes. Yeah.
So yeah, Uncle Don, you, and then several of my cousins.
Yes.
Have guided there. So
yeah, this was I did get it right. It was a Colorado gold mine.
Okay.
And I forget. I thought I had a gold mine tour is what it's called. Send 1,000 feet underground. And, one of the things I remember from the caverns, I don't think they do it anymore, but occasionally we turn off all the, we tell them in advance, but you turn off all the lights, and it's a lot darker than if you just go out at night, because literally no light is coming into the cave.
Yeah. They do not do that anymore. I can
They
attest.
do not, no.
They do not. We were not put in the darkness. I think my poor son would have climbed over both my husband and I in an attempt to get away. Bless his heart, he was having a little bit of a panic attack. And I was like, oh, it's fine. And I was telling as many funny and interesting facts as I possibly could, trying not to ignore his impending crisis, but also trying to make sure that we were helping him with it to focus on other things of, isn't this delightful? And look at that. And isn't it interesting? And he's like,
So did
sure.
did the instructions tell you the difference between stalagmites and stalactites?
They
and how you remember the difference? Did they tell you how to remember the difference?
They did not tell us how to remember the difference, but they told us
Well,
what
the
the difference is.
stalactite has to hold on tight because it's hanging from the top rather than the stalagmite.
Oh, that's clever. Now I will always remember it.
Good. Well, I don't know if that fits under legal education, but
It's interesting facts. So all of that to say, I'm drinking caffeine, and today I have a Cherry Coke Zero. That seems to be my preference, my flavor preference. That's what I'm surviving on today. What are the two of you drinking?
back to Pepsi.
All right, so you're back to Pepsi. Chelsey, are you drinking wine? Have you got the wine
Or
today?
a glass, but I always have like three. I'm a beverage goblin. There's just always many beverages, so I do have a glass of wine. This is my last box of the summer of the Franzia wine, and I'm gonna have to go back to red soon. But I also have some grape juice and water. I have lots of options.
All right. Well, I'm glad you're keeping it open there. We can choose which way, almost like a drinking game, which one you're going to drink. Is if you're drinking water, we're drinking water. Anyway, so cheers everybody, and let's go to Dr. Weil to talk about Trump. We've got two different cases for Trump. So our first one, the hearing, as I understand it, for this appeal. Do we know exactly which place in appeal? Now, in New York, it's very strange.
Right.
They call it the Supreme Court of New York,
Right.
is the district court level. And that always messed me up growing up, and especially in law school. I didn't go to New York schools, and Law and Order, doom, doom, we've got the noise, and it's like Supreme Court of New York. And I'm like, wow, why would they do the trial court? Why would they do trials at the Supreme Court?
Preliminary hearings in the Supreme Court. You're like, what is happening?
I don't understand. They must not have enough to do. And then you get to the class where it's like, oh well, they name them differently in New York. So the Supreme Court, the New York Supreme Court, is the trial level, the lower level court. So do we know exactly which court we're in for this appeal, since it's not the Supreme Court?
I believe it's a middle layer, but I'm not positive of that. In other words, it's the trial has already been held. Judge Erdogan, if I remember, there was like a $454 million judgment against Trump. It's not, by the way, it's brought by the Attorney General, but I'm going to say it's not quite like a civil case. It's not a criminal case, as I understand it. Or is it? I don't think it. I mean, it's monetary damages. It's not something he could be sent to jail for. But this, you remember, it has a lot to do with tax filings. Did he purposely deceived, and did he get some advantage by this? And apparently, during oral arguments, at least one of the judges raised concerns about the amount of the award, $454 million. To most of us, seems like a fair amount of money.
Just a little.
Although I did see that yesterday there was I can't remember the name of it. There's a bank that was fined $3 billion.
Oof.
And at least one senator said she didn't think that was a big enough penalty because, that's pocket change to them. But partly it dealt with the amount, partly it dealt with whether, and Trump had raised this before, Trump basically said, yeah, I don't know if he said I lied, but yeah, there are some discrepancies on the things that I filed, but nobody really was hurt.
There are no victims. We're the individual victims.
Yeah. He sort of portrays it as a victimless crime. I think I would differ with that. If one person is gaining a financial advantage by playing by outside the rule book, then you would think that at least indirectly would hurt anyone who is playing by the rule book. But that's how the American system of justice is supposed to work.
Yeah.
You have a trial. I mean, we had a lengthy trial,
Yes.
lots and lots of evidence, including some of Trump's former employees,
We
some
had
of which I
Michael
believe did
Cohen.
not testify, right?
Yeah, Michael Cohen did not testify in. Wait, which one did he testify
No,
in?
I think he did testify.
Yes, that was the one he testified in.
Right.
We also had his financial advisor, whoever it was,
Right.
who had cooked the books and had already pled guilty and was then
And so serving time.
perjury issues going on with
Right.
him. I mean, it was full of fun legally, not for Trump or not for the attorneys, but on a simply theoretical legal basis. When you're going to law school, you should enjoy what you do, and this is the legal theatrics, the legal theories that make law interesting. So go back to the case, and we have multiple episodes about that case as it went along. So if you want to get the nitty gritty about what exactly was happening, which witnesses were called, what they had to offer, actually Cohen testified in the Stormy Daniels case. So
Yes,
there have
'cause
been
that was
so many, I'm getting
the
confused.
prosecution's last witness. Yes.
Right. So it was the Stormy Daniels case he testified in, but not this one. But let me talk about briefly the victimless crime. I hear that a lot. I am a former prosecutor. I've been practicing 19 years. I'm a former prosecutor, a former full-time criminal defense attorney. I do some here and there. I mostly do personal injury law now. But I hear that a lot for theft crimes. And that's essentially what this is business fraud, right? Fraudulent filings, fraudulent inflations to achieve an advantage, a personal advantage, whether it's for yourself, your business, et cetera. And they used to laugh at me. I went through multiple areas in prosecuting. And when I was in Newport News, Virginia, I started off in drugs, guns, and gangs and did most of my time there. And then I went into the more victim crimes. And in that were the financial thefts, the personal thefts, the robberies, the burglaries, anything that was a form of theft. And they laughed at me a lot. They're like, oh my goodness, you would rather put a thief behind bars than a murderer. And I was like, well, it's not quite that far. But they're like, what is your issue with thieves? And there were so many, and I think this is a systemic problem throughout the country and not just Virginia or Maryland where I am now, is especially for shoplifting. Right. The stores just have to write them off. They have to factor in their yearly budget how much they're going to get robbed, get stolen out of their merchandise. Many stores have stopped sending people to court to prosecute them. There's usually what's called a loss prevention officer who would go to court and testify. And they're like, look, it's just not worth it anymore to spend our time and money sending these people to court to prosecute when the prosecutors aren't even interested and they just get away with a fine and they don't even have to repay. And it's like, why? But what I saw in so many of those cases, and what I think a lot of people don't fully understand, is the net cost to everyone.
Right.
Because of all of these shopliftings, because they're having to put that into their yearly budget. Why do you think prices are increasing? It's not just inflation. They're increasing to cover the expense of the shoplifting, to cover the expense of the theft. So in that sense, it's not to me a victimless crime. It's just the identity of the victims aren't all known.
And I think traditionally, remember the discussion that we used to have about crack cocaine versus other cocaine and how
Right.
the penalties, crack
Yes.
cocaine tended to be distributed more within low income, often minority communities, and they
Yes.
were getting harsher penalties than people who were using
The
something
powdered
just as
cocaine.
serious.
Right.
Right. And you get something similar when it comes to white collar and blue collar crime. Now, in this case, you're saying we're letting some blue I'm assuming largely blue collar criminals would be doing the shoplifting.
Right.
But sometimes, it seems so particularly when you start talking millions of dollars, it seems so abstract. It's so divorced from our own reality that, just let them worry about it.
Whatever.
Why is the state intervening? But, one of the things that people often forget, you compare our economy to that of many other nations in the world. And sometimes people say, well, it's, and it is in part because we're more capitalistic than we're socialistic. And there's a lot of different, we're better educated than others are. But a lot of it is that in the United States, I think at least, that it's not routine to have to pay a bribe everywhere you go. And there are a lot of countries in the world where businesses basically the same thing. They have to factor that in. You're going to have to pay this government agent off here. And it seems victimless in a sense. Well, who's getting hurt? Well, we're all getting hurt.
Yes.
Because we are all paying for the consequences of it.
Yeah.
And so, the people who are usually shouting that it's a victimless crime are the perpetrators. They're not typically, other businesses that went under because they were trying to play by the books.
Exactly. And I think that's the part is how many people were denied a loan because Trump needed a loan. And I'm just, this is pure theory. And
or anybody.
Know.
White collar in general, crime in general.
If I get something through false pretenses, if I fraudulently obtain something, does that prevent somebody else who actually was, like you're saying, trying to play by the rules? Is it making it harder for them, even if it doesn't prevent them? Because higher standards have to be put in place, or we're playing for the white collar versus the blue collar. And Chelsey, where are you headed?
I was just going to say, even if you can't tie it to a specific thing, it's like we live in a society that we agree to this social contract. We agree to these rules. Obviously, this is like on a super theoretical level, but like that's the whole point, right? Is that we have these laws and we're all agreeing to them to take part in it. And it's not fair. I mean, nothing's really fair. Life isn't fair. But the idea that like, if we're not enforcing the rules, what's the point, right?
Yeah. Okay, so that's what's happening there. Now let's go to the D.C. case. We've got the federal case of election interference, and goodness, we've been on a roller coaster with these cases. And especially the big wrench thrown in this summer was with the Supreme Court holding that the president does have a lot of immunity for quote unquote presidential acts. So official acts. So unofficial acts or official acts as president. So what Jack Smith, the lead prosecutor here, is trying to do is the first thing he did is reissued an indictment. So he issued a superseding indictment from a new grand jury. And it eliminated a lot of the information that was there in the first place. It eliminated a couple of co-conspirators. They took out alleged facts from those co-conspirators, where Jack Smith took an analysis and his team took an analysis and said, okay, based on the Supreme Court's ruling, we think these would be considered official acts and we can't use them to prosecute him. Now he's done phase two. Is he submitted an actual brief saying we're asking for a ruling from the court, not the Supreme Court that I know of, and Dr. Weil, you can correct us on some of these procedures, but from the actual trial court saying we want to proceed forward, but we need a ruling as to what counts as an official act that we can't use or discuss or present at the trial level versus the unofficial acts that we can use for testimony and evidence against Donald Trump in the criminal trial. Dr. Weil, break down what we have for these arguments.
Well, we have you can't tell how it's
there you go.
It's 165 pages is what you got.
Chelsey and I didn't read through it all this week.
I don't think you call this a brief. It's not a brief brief. But what you have is he goes through and tries to separate out campaign activities from, acts that, cabinet meetings. or calling your attorney general about something that might be related. And there's a couple interesting things about it. There's frankly, if you kept track, and I know it seems like ancient history now, but if you kept track of the second impeachment of Trump, much of that evidence is regurgitated, reiterated here. But what's interesting is he was able to subpoena some people that did not respond to subpoenas from Congress, including Vice President Mike Pence. And we have a lot of information now about about the specific interactions with Pence. And the point that Smith makes is effectively that a sitting president has nothing at all to do officially with the certification of the person who succeeds him. And even Pence, the vice president, I think correctly, they say, had I guess you would call it a ceremonial or there's another term to use here, ministerial duty to open the ballots in front of the joint House and Senate and tell how the ballots had come in. But so they're basically saying that any conversations that Trump had with regard to election results cannot be considered official. And the other thing that's very clever and might be even more consequential is the court says if you look at the rally on January the 6th, that rally was actually funded as a campaign activity. And
interesting.
So it's possible that even some of Trump, typically you think that the president gives a speech, he's giving a speech on behalf of the nation, but some speeches presidents give are clearly just simply campaign rhetoric. And he's saying we are able to, we can use what he said on that day related to activities that had to deal with the election and success of the election as opposed to just simple political views. It's a fairly intimidating document, and I don't know if this is going to show or not. But one of the things about it is there's a lot of redactions. Most of these are their redactions of who the particular attorney was or person, and some of them I could figure out as I think if somebody
through context clues.
I think somebody who had been in Congress and been during the second impeachment could probably fill in most of those names, but they're not readily available.
Sure.
So that is out. But it's it's a weighty document, at least in
literally
terms of reputational polls. And I think, frankly, that the arguments seem fairly. They seem sound to me. I will tell you there's a controversy over this, which is usually the Attorney General's office, and I think technically Jack Smith is under the Attorney General.
Special counsel for them,
right.
Yes.
If you'll remember the controversy in this 2016 election, where Jim Comey, director of the FBI, released information within the last 30 days, I believe
about
or
Hillary
maybe
Clinton.
I don't know whether it's 30 days or 45 days, but usually there is a policy that you don't release information that might sway an election during the time period leading directly up to an election. And so Smith has come in for some criticism for this, and as far as I know, he hasn't directly answered it. Now, I must say, ultimately, it was up to the judge, right, to decide whether this would become public. So he filed a motion to make it public. That was contested. She decided that it belonged. So maybe the criticism would more directly go to the judge than to her. The counter to that, I think the primary counter to that would be, to the extent that it's coming out now because delay has been sort of the tactic of the defense here.
Right.
And
It's coming back on his own timeline to roost, where he was hoping to push it all the way past the election.
right. But
and he
there's
pushed
still, I mean,
it,
I think
but
there
it's
is a legitimate
before.
argument. I've seen, liberal publications who or left leaning, I would say, who have said, well, we ought to at least talk about this because, we could have an equivalent situation maybe in the future. But that we know there's going to be no trial prior to the election.
Right.
And frankly, if Trump is reelected, I think most of this certainly will go away for 4 years, might go away forever, particularly if, we talked about the possibility that a president might pardon himself.
Right.
I think that would be a terrible precedent. I hope it doesn't happen by any president, but the Constitution doesn't specifically prohibit it. And, then we'd have to go to court on whether the pardon itself was constitutional. And I doubt that the court would want to weigh in on that.
Right. Now, Chelsey, let me direct some of this with you here. And we've had this, one of the continuing issues, and one I think that will be the biggest with the argument for official and unofficial acts, is what Dr. Weil was saying as far as Mike Pence's role being ministerial in nature, being ceremonial in nature. The argument on Trump's side is, well, it's not if he has his own duty to uphold the Constitution, and we believe by certifying it that they're not. So the idea of Trump's team that the actual certification for a false election is non-constitutional. What do you think about that argument in terms of making it an official act for communications with Mike Pence and discussions about alternate electors, or suspending the certification in lieu of an investigation?
Well, I think it's the best argument, right? Like, I think that type of argument here is, I mean, it would be if it was a different, I'm just trying to apply this to someone else because I don't buy the argument for this particular scenario. But I do think it's a good argument if someone's saying, I swore an oath to uphold the Constitution. And I think that's a pretty compelling argument. I think it would work. Here, I just don't buy it because it's Trump, and everyone who's watched the show knows how I feel about that. But
right.
One of the things that Smith does that I did not mention is he goes out of his way to show that the people closest to Trump, or many of the people closest to Trump, told him that the election had been fairly lost. And they also quote, and I can't remember her name, but remember there was one attorney in particular who tended to go...
Sidney Powell, right?
Yes,
Wasn't it Sidney Powell?
Right. They actually quote Trump in here. One day he's telling his age, this woman is crazy, or something similar to that. And the next day he's going somewhere and repeating exactly what she told him about the election. So if you can show that he was acting in bad faith through people who were not official, I don't believe she's not an official person on the White House staff.
No, she was not.
And so that tends to back up, well, this is not an official act. He's taking information from outsiders who are, have nothing to do with the government at all.
Well, this will definitely be an interesting development. So, Chelsey, let me bring us then to our next subject, is these executions. So last week we talked about the execution that actually went forward in Missouri, despite the prosecution's request for leniency and to convert the case to life without parole, at least take the death penalty off the table. So now we have another case in Oklahoma. What do you know about the case and what's happening there?
Yeah, so I don't have a lot of the background, but right now this is a case that's come before the United States Supreme Court. It seems like this and I don't know the exact year, someone's going to have to catch me up on it, but I mean, he has gotten very, very close to executions multiple times over and over. This case is pretty egregious. He's had multiple last meals. Like this is, and I mean, is that not cruel and unusual punishment? Like that's psychological torture.
Yeah.
But it seems like in this case, and I know Dr. Weil has a little bit more of the details, it seems like there's an issue with the original trial of them saying that, there was testimony that does seem not to be as reliable as it was thought to be at the time. And that kind of brings credibility into the whole conviction.
But let's go back.
It seems like it's a case of prosecutorial misconduct in that my understanding is the person who actually pulled the trigger is the person that was given some kind of immunity and is testified to put this other person whom he claims arranged the murder, get him capital punishment. And when the person cooperating with the state was on the stand, he indicated that no, he didn't have any mental issues at the time, that the prosecutor apparently knew that he was on antipsychotic drugs or whatever. And it's pretty well established that he lied on the stand about that and perhaps other things. And so part of it becomes, do you just throw the case out? It sounds like in the court, it's hard to read, but when the arguments were made before the Supreme Court, it looked like three of the conservatives were, let's leave this alone. 3 or 4 on the liberal side or the more liberal side, wanted to take it. And then there are probably 2 justices, including Barrett, and I'm not sure, maybe, I don't know if it's Gorsuch or I'm not sure. But anyway, there are at least 2 judges sort of in the middle. But
do we know what the official question is that's certified? Because we get a lot of these cases, and ultimately what I don't think the large majority of the population realizes is it's not just a case about execution or not just a case about abortion or whatever. There's a very specific question that the court is addressing. And unless that question is certified, it's not answered. So there are many courts where it's like, oh, it's this broad ruling. Well, really, it's not. So do we know, and maybe I'm putting everybody on the spot a little bit, and I'm admitting that I don't know right now. So I'm hoping one of you might know what the actual question is that was certified for consideration at the court.
I don't know, but I think Dr. Weil is working on it. My understanding is that the question essentially has gone all the way up through the state courts and now at the Supreme Court level is whether or not he had a fair trial. Essentially, it's a pretty narrow issue, I believe, is what they are hearing.
I think it should he be entitled to a new trial.
Okay.
And
like, what's his
where
due
I was
process?
headed before I had a little brain lapse here was one possibility that some of the justices suggested was that the Oklahoma court have a rehearing, not a retrial, but first have a rehearing on what did the prosecution know and when did they know it, and was it, part of the question is, well, would it have made a difference if people knew that he was on she said he wasn't on being treated, but he was treated, would that really have made a real difference in the outcome?
Was it a reversible error, right?
Yeah,
like, that's our question.
Right. If it's not something that had an impact, then their inclination would be, well, let's deal with that narrow issue without going into, was this a denial? Probably of due process would be my guess, right? Is based.
Right. And ultimately, they're not deciding an Eighth Amendment question. They're not deciding, is this cruel and unusual?
It's cruel and unusual.
They're deciding, should he get a new hearing or a new trial?
But what Chelsey brought up is a component that I think maybe, if I were arguing these cases, and of course I'm not an attorney, so I can't, but you do get an element of, and I think we talked about this last time, almost everybody who thinks that a penalty, particularly the death penalty, is a deterrent, would agree that to be an effective deterrent, it needs to occur within some proximity to a conviction? And to what degree have you deterred anything if, particularly, maybe somebody my age be the perfect candidate to commit a murder, right? Because you put me in for life and it's not going to be that much longer. And you're never going to be able to execute me because I can exhaust the appeals. This is not a confession, by the way.
It's like, what have you
purely
done?
theoretical here, okay? I don't want this appearing
If
on
I did
nightly
it.
news. But there was a case, Francis versus Louisiana. I'm remembering right in 1948ish, out of Louisiana, where Louisiana had a ambulatory electric chair. And they would take it around to various jurisdictions, and they put this poor guy in there, and it malfunctioned. And then they get ready to execute him again. He says, "This is cruel and unusual." And the court, if I remember, disagreed. They said, no, it wasn't malicious. And there's been a couple of times since where they have
Accidents
done it.
happen.
Where it's happened. To me, I always thought that was one of the tests that the court sometimes uses in due process cases, and it's vague, but something that shocks the conscience. And to me, sitting in an electric chair for a second or third time would shock my conscience even before they turn the electricity on.
Yeah, it's like a beheading that goes wrong. How many more times have you got to chop me? It's just that ick, like Chelsea's word, that ick factor. And
you talk, about acts of God, maybe somebody's trying to tell you something if when you pull the lever, nothing happens.
Work, right. And for anybody who's seen or read The Green Mile, the electric chairs, especially, vivid imagery of what can go wrong and how painful it can be. And that's why many states, is it fully outlawed now as cruel and unusual, or is it most states?
No, it's not.
Tennessee used to have it. They don't now. But growing up,
we're going to start. We're going to restart executing people next year if we can.
Okay.
Or so the news said a couple nights ago. So.
Okay. And do you remember old Sparky? That's what they called the electric chair in Tennessee. It was old Sparky. And I remember...
I can tell you which states have it. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. If anybody wants to take a guess.
Got to be southern states.
Tennessee is on there. I'll give you one.
Texas. Oh, no.
No, not Texas.
You say, there's a related controversy. How many? 5?
No, so we have Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Kentucky, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Tennessee.
Okay, 7.
Southern states.
Look at that.
Okay, I have to let me finish old Sparky and then
Yes.
Dr. Vile, you can continue. I remember in college, I was on the mock trial team and Dr. Vile was coaching it, and we had we were law nerds. We were total nerds. This is not your football team. I was the mock trial team, but I loved it. And we were all into these cases and learning trial advocacy and the art of advocacy. And it was during those years, I don't remember exactly which one, but it was while we were in college preparing to go to law school that they decided to sell old Sparky. And we had the funniest night talking about, could we, the team, Dr. Vile had nothing to do with this. He probably doesn't even know about it. But my little team had...
I might have tried to execute a few of you had I known, but...
We had the funniest conversations into the wee hours of the morning of, could we raise the funds among the little team to buy old Sparky, and what would we do with it if we could? And one of them was suggesting that, we become criminal defense attorneys and we buy the chair and put it as our client chair, so anybody who came in could, get in and feel, see how comfortable they could get in the chair, and would they, if they're not too comfortable, then they should hire you. We had the funniest night, and I don't know where old Sparky went, but we had at least some great arguments of what we should do with it and how it could be used in our law offices.
And, we have, where it was headed, we do have some equivalences here. A lot, I guess most states now have gone to lethal injection. Mm-hmm. And some of the companies that were selling the ingredients for this said, we only sell medical supplies to help people, not to kill people.
Mm.
And so states have been trying out, I think the latest is nitrogen gas versus oxygen or something.
Ugh.
But sometimes they end up, some of the potential executees are sort of guinea pigs.
Yeah.
And there have been a lot of, a number of cases that have come to the court as a cruel and unusual to be testing this out, for the first time. Are we absolutely sure that this method isn't going to result in excessive, pain or suffering? And of course, you almost always get a popular reaction, which is, I don't think, the legal reaction, but there's always somebody who will say, well, the more painful it is, the better.
Right.
We want deterrence. They kill somebody in cold blood, they should get their comeuppance. And I get that, but we do have a provision against cruel and unusual punishment.
Right.
And the job of the state is not to imitate the worst criminals in our society by replicating their own behavior.
Right. No, I think that's a really good point. And I had many victims of crimes that I prosecuted throughout the years and I totally understood. It's a very similar sentiment, Dr. Weil, that you're expressing here, as many of them said, I don't want them to get prison. I want the same thing to happen to them that they did to my sister, me, to whatever. And I understand that sentiment. But it is, I like what you're saying, is that's not the state. That's not
well, if
our
you think
role.
about it, law in many ways, criminal law is in many ways a substitute for personal revenge.
Yes.
And what typically happen in revenge is somebody pokes at your eye and you go back and poke at two of theirs.
Mm.
Or, they kill one of your family members, so you wipe out their family. And part of it is to try, there's a certain proportionality that you want in law, but you always want to make sure it doesn't exceed the crime itself.
Right. Okay, well, I think those are our topics for the week, unless I have missed one.
Well, we should say something just briefly, I think, about the hurricanes.
Yes.
Because
It's not a legal topic per se, but it's certainly a major world event.
But there are legal dimensions here.
Yes.
One of the fascinating things are how many people stay behind when they're mandatory orders.
Yeah.
Sometimes at the cost of their own lives.
Yes.
The other thing that's come is it does appear, and I think this is more one side than the other, but we seem to be politicizing. If you remember, right, politicizing disasters. So some people may remember when Chris Christie was governor of New Jersey, he got, and I forget what the hurricane was that hit that state, but they had more damage than you would expect from that part of the country. And he was criticized for calling Obama and, working with him to get aid to his people. And now we have, and I think it's been remedied, but you had at least one governor who apparently refused to talk to president or vice president during a disaster. I think that's been worked out. But, they used to say that politics should end at the water's edge. And that actually didn't refer to hurricanes. It referred to foreign policy. That, if we're in NATO, we're all in NATO. It's not one president's in, the other's out, and that sort of thing. But really the same thing ought to be applying, maybe even more so, to natural disasters. It shouldn't depend on whether you have a Democratic or Republican president or governor as to whether you're going to, if you have aid out there, it should be available equally. And I think it has been. But the charges are no, they're treating some states differently, and I'm not going to talk to, I'm big, He-Man governor. I'm not going to talk to the president. That doesn't get us anywhere, and it's really it doesn't speak well, I think, for the current state of politics, and maybe things will get a little bit better after the next presidential election. We will see.
Yeah, it's interesting because certainly it's a different type of disaster. It's a natural disaster and extremely widespread, with bajillions of dollars, billions of dollars. I'm not supposed to say bajillions, but billions of dollars of damage throughout the state. And in looking at 9/11, with that disaster, it was a terror-related act, but I don't think anybody said, well, no, you're this organization, you shouldn't come.
Yeah.
Or, it's only a state thing. It's only a federal thing. It was like, whoever can come and help, come and help. We'll accept anybody.
And part of it is how issues get mixed together. So, the charge is that there's not enough money for FEMA because we've been giving money to illegal aliens. There's no evidence for that I can find. Done some research on this. Yes, there has been money allocated sometimes for refugee relief and that sort of thing, but it wasn't taken out of the FEMA budget. FEMA budget is low because we've had 2 hurricanes coming in very quick succession. But these are the kind of things that I really think it's unethical to try to take these issues and make up. People are suffering and dying.
Yeah.
Take care of them as best you can. And certainly during the Bush administration, there was criticism of how they handled the hurricane that hit New Orleans, and I think it was justified. Although I don't think it was out of malice, I think it was simply incompetence. They didn't have the right people on the ground at the right time. They seem to have done as much as they could in the current circumstances, and not, there's not. You don't have to make everything. I mean, in a sense, everything is political because it's all related, but you don't have to make it a partisan political issue. And it really doesn't do much there. And, the other thing you haven't talked about, major biography came out this week, or autobiography.
Let's have
Melania
Chelsey
Trump.
Address this one.
I have not read it. I read a stimulating review in the Washington Post that suggests that it has more to do with facial, keeping your face exfoliated than it does with politics. But she did apparently take a position contrary to her husband on the issue of abortion. And this, by the way, it's not the first time this has happened. If you're nobody will remember but me. But during the Ford administration, Ford was basically pro-life, and his wife, Betty, basically was pro-choice. And a wife has a right to disagree with her husband, I suppose. Well, not, I affirm, wife has the right. Okay, cut that part out here.
Let's talk to your wife.
Yeah, no, I don't. Okay, we don't have a doghouse big enough for me right now, so.
That's funny. Chelsey, what you love these types of things, and I know you don't read a lot of autobiographies, but I know you get excited about these types of issues. So what's your thought on Melania's book?
Okay, so here's the thing. Here's the thing about it, and this is why I find it so interesting. Is like, especially when you have people who are this in the spotlight. Nothing is done in an accidental time. These aren't coincidences. So what I was most interested in, and I do plan on reading this, even though it's not my general favorite type of literature, just because I'm so morbidly curious. Like, I just have to know. But I think the timing.
Minds.
Yes.
That's it. Yeah. What can I say? Curiosity killed the cat. But I'm so curious about the decision to release this at this time. Because some people see it as like I think you can interpret it 2 ways. You can see it as this was a dig at her husband to be divisive, or you can see it as an appeal to a demographic of voters that the Trump campaign continually has a hard time reaching. That's women, especially on women's reproductive health issues. So I'm not sure which it is. And I've seen her do a couple interviews talking about the book. So I think you can kind of take it either way. It just seems like strange to me that the timing of, we haven't heard her really speak. I don't remember the last time she did an interview.
All.
Maybe I've missed it. But it does seem
she's been one of the least vocal first ladies we've had.
And one of the fascinating things in the book is apparently, she's involved in part in reaction to January 6th because she was called upon to issue a statement against violence, and she didn't do so. And her explanation, which I'm getting through hearsay, I'm getting through this article that I read in the Washington Post, her answer is she didn't know what was going on. She was filming in the White House to show what she had done for the decor there in the White House. And if I can mention one other thing, since we're at the tail end here, but Chelsey mentioned demographics and how, this could be partly coordinated as a way to, to appeal to some women. Democrats are having concerns right now, particularly about Black men,
Right.
that typically, African Americans have tended to vote 80, 90% Democrat as opposed to Republican fairly consistently. But apparently there is some concern that some African American men are not ready to be led by a woman president. And maybe it's coming out in other ways. But, we may be with women. I thought we were to the point where we were when Biden ran for president and Catholicism. When Kennedy was actually the second Catholic president. Al Smith were presidential candidate. Al Smith had run. Kennedy in 1960, it was a big issue. And you hardly heard anything about it when Joe Biden ran for president. He's also Catholic. And I thought, okay, we had a third party candidate in the 19th century. We've had Hillary Clinton. Now we have Kamala. Probably not a big deal, but it may be one of those things that people are not willing to say out loud. But, we've talked about in the past about evangelical voting, and evangelicals as a group have tended to emphasize male headship, male leadership. And a lot of what we forget is a lot of African Americans come out of this evangelical tradition. Now, they split with white evangelicals in terms of their Democrat Republican support, but it may be that, although, now having said that, the few African American services that I've been to, often they do actually have more female leaders than they do male leaders in terms of deaconesses and that sort of thing. But it's just one of these things. Presumably we have, really there's not hardly any emphasis on the fact that Kamala Harris is African American.
Right.
I mean, not in the same way that there was when Obama. So it's like we're maybe over that hurdle, but maybe we're not quite as far along as we thought we would be on, whether a woman is equally entitled, equally capable of being a president to a man. And I think we're getting there.
Right.
But it's sometimes, this is what's so wrong with polling. Not wrong with it, but one of the difficulties pollsters face is that people will tell you some things and other things they're not going to tell you.
Yeah.
And, with Trump particularly, polling has been more difficult because, and it probably works both ways. I mean, when I visited the Shenandoah Valley, it seemed pretty clear that it was Trump territory.
Yes.
There were 3 or 4 signs Trump for every Harris that I saw. If I'm getting polled from that area, do I want to differ with my neighbor? Maybe I'll do it in the privacy of the voting booth, but maybe not to a pollster. And that, that works both ways.
And I love that Chelsey's mentioned before that she's been getting a lot of poll requests in her area.
Non-stop polling.
You live in the wrong state.
I know. I swear, half of the text messages on my phone are just, please answer our polls constantly.
Well,
you're in a swing state.
I know. It's driving me nuts, though.
This is, I have thought about writing an article about how Tennessee should follow Nebraska and Maine and split its electoral votes. It's not required. And the advantage would be the disadvantage, which is we would finally be getting the attention. But do we really want it?
Right.
And what's surprising, and maybe one of you will know this. I mean, I don't know enough about how ads are sold, but we have seen a surprising number of ads for the presidents in Tennessee. And every time I see one, it's like, well, you're wasting your money. It's a red state. It's going to vote for Trump. I mean, not that I'm a prophet or anything, but that's seems
Right.
pretty obvious.
It's
And
like trying to
I
put,
honestly don't know why they are spending money on advertisements here.
I don't know either.
They're
It would,
spending so much here. I swear.
yours
And
makes sense.
It does. I even had for the first time. So, I mean, aside from law school, all of my adult life, I lived in Georgia. I had my first door knocker for a political campaign ever.
Oh, wow.
And I mean, like I said, all of my adult life, I lived in Georgia. Before that, I moved around a lot, but it was the first time. Unluckily for him, it was for Trump. So, and I answered the door. So
that poor man.
it was nice. I was like, I'm
Well,
so
but
glad
you know,
you're.
that's interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
that may suggest, I think generally the opinion is that Democrats have been better organized on the ground than Republicans have, but maybe not.
Yes. And that's
Or,
what I would
you know,
say. The 2016 election, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
And like I said, I was in law school for like the next one, but I don't know. I was shocked because at first I was like, who is walking up to my house? Because he didn't have a shirt on, like he was just normal clothes. And he was like, I'm here for Trump. And I was like, you're out of luck, bud. You gotta go.
You know, well,
I
see
love
what you're
political
supposed to
activism,
do
but
if it's your opponent, you're supposed to spend an hour and waste their time.
I know.
So they can't get
If
to
I
the other
had-
houses. That's
Yeah,
funny.
I still remember when the first knock on our door for somebody for Abraham Lincoln, and you know, I just or some of my students believe.
That's funny. We have in Maryland, I feel very similar, Dr. Vile, is why would anyone put a presidential ad in Maryland? Is, you know, whatever we vote, it's going to go toward, we believe, Harris, right? This seems consistent with the others. But what we are getting right now is the Senate race. Because
Well, and
we've
there
got
you got
Hogan.
a fairly highly contested race, so that would make sense.
Extremely contested because we have Larry Hogan, who was our former governor.
Right.
And in a Democratic stronghold, we had a Republican governor, which is very unusual. The public, for the most part, loved him. Absolutely loved him. And so he's termed out for governor, and now he's up for Senate. And it's truly an issue not just of really personhood, as well, he says he's a Republican, but he's not. So it's more of a party issue is, are you going to vote for the Republican? And the slur campaigns are, who's not a Republican, versus the Democrat. So that's very interesting. I predict that Hogan will win simply because of the strong support he's had in this state.
He's not leading in the polls right now, to my knowledge.
That's fascinating then.
I could be wrong on that, but and it's very interesting. There was an editorial either in the New York Times or the Post, probably the Post, basically condemning him for not running as an independent.
Right.
And I think my response to that is, you know, if you believe that he represents some of the values of the older Republican Party, don't you want him to stay within that party and try to correct it?
Right.
As opposed to jumping ship or starting a new, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
But that's going to be a fairly consequential race there.
Absolutely will be.
But,
Huge
you know,
race.
if he is elected, I mean, I think there's something to this. If he is elected and Trump is elected, I think that you could expect to find significant differences between Trump and him.
Yes.
And in a sense, and of course, there, you know, it's possible you could do it after the election. We have two independents right now, I believe, in the U.S. Senate. And I believe, at least in one of those cases, that they ran as under a party and then changed their affiliation once they were there. And I believe both independents right now caucus with the Democrats.
Right.
So it probably doesn't make much difference, but fascinating time.
Absolutely fascinating time. So we'll see what other legal hijinks come up in the next couple of weeks. In the meantime, prayers for those in the path of the storm and who have been hit. It certainly is extremely tragic and shocking to watch. If there is anything people feel compelled to do for the hurricane relief, certainly do that. We've got some programs up here in Maryland, and specifically some of my networking groups that are putting together to send some relief down there. So we're going to be pleased pleased and proud to be part of that. In the meantime, check out thelawunscripted.com. Stay tuned for our podcast. Like and subscribe. Feel free to mention a comment, suggest a topic for, usually they're fairly obvious what they will be each week, but suggest one if you'd like us to add one in for the spattering of topics through the taping. In the meantime, have a wonderful week. We wish you a good happy hour. We wish you luck and blessings in all that you do this week, and we will catch you next time on the Legal Weekly Wine.